There was a time when critical race theory referred to a relatively obscure and mostly legal framework for analyzing structural racism, which by definition became a controversial term. Critical racial theorists included folks such as Derrick Bell, Kimberlé Crenshaw, and Richard Delgado. And their fundamental belief was that it was foolish to talk about race. That is to say, that race as such is not any established reality. Race is a negative, derogatory category that's been established by folks, white folks, to oppress and to disable the Black community. The more I looked at critical race, and I hope this will keep you with me through this, the more excited I got and the more interested I got in what they had to offer. Basically, that race is not biologically grounded, and it's not a natural phenomenon. It's a social construct needed to exploit people of color, and in addition, create the concept of racism that is not an aberration. It's not a mess up by certain folks in the society, white folks, but that racism is a normal feature of American society. That criticism reached the ears of a man named Christopher Rufo, R-U-F-O. You need to learn more about that guy. The short story is he became a Trump advisor, and it was subsequently that, listening to Rufo, who expanded the definition of critical race theory to include anything that disrupts whitewashed interpretations of American history and current events. That's his language. And did so to intentionally ignite partisan or ultra conservative activism around education policy and curriculum content. We hear about critical race theory these days because when conservatives took up the fight, they really very successfully fomented a national furor, supposedly about the CRT's success in indoctrinating kids in school, particularly K-12. And many progressives, like myself, dismissed CRT because our sense was that it was a obscure and legally enclosed concern, and represented an academic approach to the way you look at race. And one of the things that I can tell you is that I got really annoyed because they kept kicking back words that I didn't understand or didn't know why in the world I had to understand. Like intersectionality, the intersectionality between the law and racism, or racism and the law. What I learned as I went along is that these legal scholars, and most of these folks are well-trained lawyers who in their early history fought furiously for racial justice, and whose experience disappointed them so much that they, in essence, retreated to the ivory tower of academia. And I mean, they did it. Their law schools across the country had centers for critical race theory as part of the law school. And for a long time, the only place where you learned anything about critical race theory was if you were connected to some kind of legal activist group that directed you to them. I will later suggest a couple of places. If you really get excited about this, you can spend an enormous amount of time learning some of the stuff I learned. As the controversy grew, and as parents became increasingly concerned, obviously the Black community in particular wondered what in the world was going on and why in the world is this obscure, abstract group of lawyers creating chaos. Well, of course, it was not the lawyers who were creating the chaos. Critical race theory is a highly disciplined academic model of research that they use very, very, very seriously and very carefully. But there were the kind of initiatives that were taken by Rufo's friend Donald Trump, for instance. I forget what he called the legislation. It's September 17th, 2020. Trump announced critical race theory and the formation of the 1776 Commission to promote patriotic education. On January 20th, 2021, Joe Biden rescinded Trump's order and dissolved the 1776 Commission. That did not end the matter. I think you know, as I do, that folks like U.S. Representative Jim Banks of Indiana sent a letter to fellow Republicans in June 2021, and I quote, "As Republicans, we reject the racial essentialism that critical race theory teaches, namely that our institutions are racist and need to be destroyed from the ground up." There were subsequently, here are the numbers, in 2022 alone, state legislatures introduced 71 new bills across 22 states targeting schools. At the same time, many politicians, school board members are also making moves to ban books from public schools and libraries that make any reference to, and you may have seen this in the news lately, the use of the word gay. Just the use of the word gay is one of the targets that these enemies of CRT are trying to enact in law, that you can't use that word in public schools. When the supporters of CRT indicate that racism isn't just an attitude or a prejudice that one person has against another, but it is an established institutional reality, they point to such things as the US Census. The most recent US Census 2020 count, reported USA Today, March 13th, reveals a shocking undercount, a euphemism for not being counted at all, of certain groups of people. Latinos had been undercounted almost 5%, a shocking increase 3 times the rate in 2010. Blacks, Native Americans had also increased rates of being undercounted over the experience in 2010. The white population had an overcount. I think it's important for you to know that there are some incredible institutions working on this controversy. There is a Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy at Columbia University Law School. You'll hear the name, I mentioned it earlier, of Kimberlé Crenshaw. And if you just want to jump in, there is a Race and the Law Prof blog. The Race and the Law Prof, as in short for professor, I think, but it could be professional, blog. There is a constitutional law conference at Rutgers University, a Center for Security, Race, and Rights. And a particular individual, my sister, who John mentioned earlier, mentioned to me an individual by the name of Russell Robinson, who is a lawyer who was initially at the Berkeley School of Law, and I think he's now at San Francisco, but I forget what the law school there is called. And he is, in some folks' eyes, the most eloquent and brilliant defender of critical race theory. And he's close enough, we may be able to get our hands on him someday, is the reason I mention it. I did not stop, as I planned to do in this presentation, to say that we scheduled this during the week on which Dr. King's assassination occurred in Memphis, April 4th in 1968. I wanted to be sure that we remembered Dr. King, and I'm going to say that we will, changing the presentation some, we will later, I will be asking you to join me in a moment of silence, not only for Dr. King, but obviously for the citizens of the Ukraine who are fighting for their lives, for their freedom, And I would like to be sure that one piece of the material which I had prepared, that Dr. King has a brief speech which he delivered in Memphis, and I would like you to hear it before we go any further.
Problems of history is that the concepts of love and power have usually been contrasted as opposites. So that love is identified with a resignation of power, and power with a denial of love. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love, implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love.
I kept thinking, one of the ways, obviously, that change is made in the country is by the law. And that if lawyers were getting skeptical about the effectiveness of law, what other options do we have? And what Dr. King is telling us, in my opinion, is that any discussions about structural racism or racism, period, must not depend on either our freedom from racism or other people's willingness to change their mind. What it must depend on is our finding ways to establish mechanisms of power, and the law typically has been one of them, that enable change to be made. And Dr. King says, as you heard, that love without power is, as a matter of fact, weak. And most of us grew up thinking that it was our responsibility, when we look racism in the face, to love racists. I think if we're going to change racism, we have to figure out ways to change the structure of our nation so that the ongoing systematic injustices are erased. That means power. And I'm just sorry that the folks that I've met so far in critical race do not spend enough time talking about power. I'm going to stop. If there are comments, Avi, I can't see the screen now. I'd be glad to hear from you.
Richard, Marilyn and I can help facilitate since we can see the screen.
Okay, thank you.
So people want to jump in or comment, say something?
I really appreciated your talks so far, Richard. It's really, really good, and I'd like to get it in writing, and maybe we can have some way to transcribe the recording from today. I'm hopeful for that at least.
Okay.
Thought it was excellent and really informative. What do other people think?
One example how racism is part of the institutions of our society and the political institutions is the movement, the law and order mechanisms that we had going on.
Yes, yes, yes.
And crack and powder cocaine, you know, those are two ways that racism was manifest in the political systems of our day, back in the 80s and 90s, I guess. And we need to change those policies. And of course, Jim Crow prison, the prison industrial complex kind of thing, where the most people in prison are black or brown. Well, the percentages in prison as opposed to the percentages in the society. So those are three manifestations of how race is embedded in our political systems. We need to change those.
Sadia, you want to say something?
I was just thinking about the person in San Francisco. What's his role? Chester Boudin. What's his label?
City attorney.
City attorney, and how he's in so many ways trying to change that and put less people in prison and really look at, justice and racial justice. And, he lived with the experience of both of his parents being in jail most of his childhood growing up. But how he's under attack now from the right, who want to recall him because he's doing the right thing. No.
And
Mona.
I'd like to say that was great, Richard Lawrence, what you've done. But were you able, any of you, to see the article on racism without racists by Dr. Sanford Dornbush, Dr. Carroll, and humbly Mona Von Scott? Now it's a part of psychology, but the New York Times had said in more recent years that it was started by our trio. Now you talk about power. When things go along institutionalized, that's where the power is, where you don't even know who the racist is or what they look like. I think that's good. And the person who's in education, this was done by Dr. Dornbush and myself and Dr. Carroll, and under the research division in education at Stanford. I think that's something that all of you, if you haven't read it, should.
Thanks, Mona. That's
Would you repeat the title again, Mona, please?
Yes, Racism Without Racists.
Thank you.
If at some point there's a link that you can share on how people can access that, send that to me and I'll share it with people.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
It's research too, with 3 cities, 1 San Francisco and 2 back east.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to mention an article that I found very useful over the years that's related to critical race theory, but isn't itself part of that, but it's part of the history, I believe. And it provides a little bit of context, in my view. At least 1 or 2 of you made reference to Angela Davis and her contributions to this endeavor to address racism and other injustices. Her professor at the University of California in San Diego was Herbert Marcuse, and he wrote a number of things, but there's one article, it's a long article, it's essentially a third of a very short book. The short book was written by him and 2 others. They each have their own essay in the book, and it's called A Critique of Pure Tolerance. And Marcuse's particular essay in this book is called Repressive Tolerance. And I think he meant, just as Dr. King was juxtaposing power and love, but saying, in a way they're not really, but they kind of end up getting that way. Marcuse intended to put the word repressive in front of the word tolerance, because in our culture, it's like, who can argue with tolerance?
Yeah.
And the intent of the article and the substance of the article was to say that tolerance taken to a universal excess means tolerating some things, tolerating the most powerful existing things, many of which are really awful. I'm using my words, not his, but it's kind of like if you look at our society or any society, there's awful things, and unfortunately, those awful things are usually awful things that are institutionalized and supported by the powers that be. And if one just consistently acts as though to tolerate everything, then that power will perpetuate itself. So in like the part of your talk, Richard, you mentioned Christopher Rufo, whose name I hadn't heard before. Well, if one simply tolerates, so to speak, the ideas of Christopher Rufo, alongside of, even if one were to go so far, it's a contradiction, but even if one were to go so far as to say, well, we'll tolerate critical race theory and we'll tolerate Christopher Rufo, well, it's not a fair fight.
No.
Not a fair fight, because the Christopher Rufos of the world have a lot more power, a lot more access to media, et cetera, than the advocates of critical race theory. And so the essential point of Marcuse's article on repressive tolerance was to say that we can't be equally tolerant of everything in the world, and we have to take special steps if we are to address the injustices that are perpetrated by the powers that be. This is my oversimplified thumbnail sketch of that article. But I read that article as a young man. It was very informative to me in terms of my own thinking about justice and education and a lot of things. And that article, along with some other articles related to critical race theory, I will confess, are not only part of Weiser's curriculum in higher education and social change and education community, but they're also part of one required course that we have for our MFT students. Our MFT students must take a lot of courses to meet state requirements and to learn what they need to know. And despite that, Weiser imposes on these students one other course that they have to pursue, which is the course on social justice and social change. So all Weiser students they don't have to toe a party line, but they are subjected to reading and thinking about such things. Anyway, that's that.
Richard, will you be writing this up? Do you have it written up? That you can share it with us in your resources? I mean, I think it's important.
It's written. I would have to reorganize it before I would release it, but yes, I could do
I just want
that.
to encourage you. It's really important.
Yeah,
and I'd like to listen again to your original comments, and it'd be wonderful if it was written down and the resources, some of as much as you can, do. No rush, but I just want to encourage you in that.
I want to refer myself to a book I have not read, but I read a substantive review of by Sahir Aziz, who's a professor of law and chancellor's social justice scholar at Rutgers Law School, in which the author, Ibram Kendi, says this: the role of the racists is well known, and he lists a bunch of them. But what about the anti-racists? This is sort of reinforcing John's point. According to Kendi, they are often assimilationists. I hope you know what that suggests. That is, if you just act right, you can somehow escape racism. According to Kendi, though, the assimilationists are often mistaken for anti-racists. W.E. Du Bois, Martin Luther King, in their younger years, both sought to persuade whites that Black deserved equality on condition that they would assimilate into white middle-class norms, lifestyles, and behaviors, even though the white middle class wanted nothing to do with Blacks in the neighborhood, in their schools or the churches. The the interviewer says that Kendi's book, which is entitled
Not a big one.
Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. Even if it were no good, that the title is certainly worth our taking a look at it, I think. But the review that I've read suggests it is very good, and it will help us clarify the distinctions of racist, anti-racist. There is clearly the tone in that you know, Dr. King's contributions to us in his later years included that we can't sit around and just do nothing. That there is no place in a democracy or country that wants to be a democracy for lazy citizens. Democracy lives only because we march, we sing, we protest, we stand up for what we believe. And that, to me, is part of a difference here, that an anti-racist is an activist. Wanting pretty much the same thing, I think, that an assimilationist wants, which is to live in a community where we are accepted and loved and supported and can live in peace. But we're willing to fight for it. And there are a couple of pieces, and I will go to them now, starting with the first, if you would. Dr. King's assassination date is April 4th, 1968. He was, as you know, shot down on the porch of the Lorraine Hotel. And he was willing, as his speech from the night before indicates, and we have that for you to hear, that he might see the promised land, but he didn't expect to get there. But that didn't discourage him or stop him from supporting and fighting for those who were trying to get there. In that case in Memphis, as you know, it was sanitation workers, garbage collectors. Also, none of us these days can escape the Ukraine. And I am living in considerable misery, and I'm sure all of you are, that every day we find ourselves unable to really put an end to what has been just a brutal slaughter of Ukrainian citizens. And before that, obviously, there were hundreds of folks in the freedom movement across the world who died in the cause of attempting to help us find freedom. And if you would, I would appreciate it if we would bow in just a moment of silent meditation and thanks for the folks who fought for freedom and those who died for freedom. Thank you all very much. There are two remaining pieces that
It's a little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. is a little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. Is a little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. May we know that together. This a little light of
Light of
mine.
mine. I'm gonna let it shine.
Hold on a minute. That was right pitiful. I know you New Yorkers got some more energy. We are affirming ourselves, folks. Please do it beyond a whisper. Let me hear you now. There's a little light of mine. There you are.
I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine.
Everywhere I go, you know that
I'm gonna let it
let
shine.
it shine.
Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine.
Your solo. This
Little light of mine. Where are you? I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine.
Let it shine. Let it
Let it
shine.
That's Odetta.
We've got to give ourselves to this struggle until the end. Nothing would be more tragic than to stop at this point in Memphis. I want to thank God once more for allowing me to be here with you. I left Atlanta this morning and then I got into Memphis. And some began to say the threats, or talk about the threats that were out. What would happen to me from some of our sick white brother? Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Thank you very much. Are there other comments? I think that might be a showstopper. I'm sorry.
Well, little by little, we continue the struggle. The eyes on the prize.
Amen.
But George Floyd's death and sending him to prison.
Yes.
The mostly white jury that said that Ahmaud Arbery was killed by racism. These are signs that we're moving forward.
All right.
And little by little, we have to raise up the signs that we move forward with, and
yes, we do.
put ourselves with, support those things.
Amen.
Do even more things as we move forward.
Thank you. Ronald wants to say something. Ronald, do you want to go ahead? Welcome.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you for the program today and your presentation, Richard. My question is, a couple of years ago, the city of San Francisco opened up their Office of Racial Equity. A few years prior to that, the city of Oakland opened a department on racial equity. And this is a part of a movement of local governments throughout the country, starting in the Northwest, Portland, Seattle, and growing out. What's your thought about this movement of creation of offices of racial equity, departments of racial equity, addressing racial equity, not only within the confines of city government, county government, but the broader community that they serve? And what potential is there for institutions like Wiser to learn from their work, collaborative projects, etc.? Thank you.
One of the words that we've got to really understand is equity. And while you can establish an office, I think you need to be certain that people understand that there's a difference between equity and equality. And folks tend to get angry because they think everybody should be treated equally. And when you set up an office of equity, you also need to be certain that you educate the citizens of whatever community is engaged with the distinction of what restorative justice requires. And equity is a restorative justice mechanism. It's a new sensitivity to the difference we've made in the ability of certain communities to make a living versus what other communities can do, black and white in particular. And I think without the education and without a commitment from the community, that when those steps then are taken that are going to be required and are going to be unpopular, if we are going to truly address the inequities that currently exist, then we've got something going. The office in and of itself, I don't know what it's done. I'm suspicious. And I think that, you know, we need to put on the street sort of, well, just call it Citizens for Equity. Know that there need to be folks out there who understand restorative justice and who understand equity and who understand the long history of unfair economic practices and who will make our public servants do the right thing, because it's not going to be popular.
Melvin wants to say something as well.
Sure.
Thank you.
I had a comment and a question. The question is, I just want to know the title of that book you spoke about, the definitive.
Yes,
and,
I'll get.
And then the comment I wanted to make was, usually we had introductions in the beginning, and I left off part of my introduction because in regards to critical race theory, I say that I'm surviving nowadays because we're in the middle of two pandemics, and one is COVID, and the other one
Yes.
the other was ignorance. And these people with that opposition to CRT is just,
I hear you.
oh man, it's Marxism, it's communism.
Yes.
If you just look up Wikipedia, and it's got a real definition of, and it's CRT is nothing that can be taught really. It's really a discussion tool, isn't it? What is that? A teaching tool?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It's a matter of educating folks about a different perspective, a different way to look at realities, specifically, obviously, about race. And it's too long been in academia. You know, to me, it's sad that it has come into the public eye and public interest with the lead in the introduction that comes from guys like Rolf, who, you know, whose clear purpose is to defame it, and Trump, who put it on put a 1776 commission up against it. And campaigned about how serious the danger was that critical race theory was promoting. I do think that you will enjoy. All you have to remember about that book is stamped from the beginning. That's the actual title, and then the subtitle is The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. As I said, I haven't read it. I read a long review, and every indication is, and I intend to get it, it's well worth reading.
That's great. Thanks, Richard.
And How to Be Anti-Racist is Kendi's
Yes,
book.
yes,
And it talks about assimilation, and it talks about anti-racism.
yes.
It talks about racist. Three different ways of talking about relating to racism. So I think
So you've read it, Johnson?
we've studied it a bit. Yeah.
Ah, good, good. So do you second my recommendation?
Yeah, of course I second.
Thank you.
And we studied the book Caste too, which relates
Yeah.
the way we treat people
Yeah.
to put them on the bottom rung all the time in India and Nazi Germany and the United States. Nazi Germany learned from the United States how to put people on the bottom rung and actualize that against Jews and gypsies and gay people. So there's a lot of that still going on.
Yes, thank you.
Putting people on the bottom rung, gay people, women in some ways, you know, disabled people.
Right.
Yes,
Thank
you
Sorry.
may have noticed we just did another a first Black female
Yeah, right.
on the Supreme Court. You
Yeah.
know,
Anji.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Greg, you were trying to say something.
Yeah, hi, and thanks for your presentation, Dr. Lawrence. Much appreciated, and
Thank you.
The discussion has been really good too. A couple of things I wanted to say. Of course, I think it's odd that this, as you just stated so eloquently, Dr. Lawrence, the way this came out, I had never heard of critical race theory before. I wonder how many of us had until it was brought up. Obviously, this is the terminology a straw man, something that is created for the very purpose of attacking it. Even in academia, I'll bet there's only a very small number of people. Now, of course, I've been looking at racism, racist issues for a long time, and trying to see where I fit in and the activism that my wife and I here do.
Yes.
And in that pursuit, I read a book by Carolyn Anderson called White Rage. Carolyn Anderson being an incredibly well-spoken historian, and she's even made it onto mainstream newscasts in recent years, only subsequent to the George Floyd demonstrations, when a lot of mainstream media was more or less forced to suddenly find that, oh yeah, there's some Black historians out there that have a different point of view. Anyway, the point being about her book called White Rage, and this is a riff on the mainstream view of Blacks, people rioting in various cities. Oh, it's just another example of Black rage, and this unreasonable destruction, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So what she's saying is, no, what we have here and what we have with CRT is white rage. And what she does is go back in history and look at every example where African-American people made some social progress in this country, and how at every turn, whether it be right after slavery, right after the failure of Reconstruction, right after what happened during what happened in Oklahoma in the 1920s, and what happened after the Civil Rights Movement, there's always a backlash that tries to take back those gains. And here we are, of course, with some tiny modicum of progress from the George Floyd demonstrations. Is that progress structural? Probably not yet. But are there more Black faces in media and on news programs? Yes, and that's a good thing, even though it's small. But here it is, once again, just as Anderson points out in all these other situations throughout our sordid history regarding racial relations, saying, here it is, here's the backlash. And of course, led by Trump. Trump is gone, but Trumpism still exists. And remember, he's not he's not the cause of it. He's one of the effects of something that has been simmering in our country for a long time.
Yes, it
So
has.
Carolyn Anderson, White Rage, very good book.
Great,
Thank you.
Signe is trying to say something, and Ronald, I'm not sure if you wanted to say something else or if your hand was still up on the screen, but let's start with Signe, and then Ronald, maybe you, if you have something to
Yes,
add.
I do. Thank you.
Okay, let's go with Signe first, and then you, Ronald, if you don't mind.
Okay. People have been referring to different books, and I want to put this one on the table.
Okay.
Resmaa Menakem, one of his books is called My Grandmother's Hands.
Oh, yes.
And he points out that political and social approaches to racism are not sufficient, and that it's essential that we begin to look at somatic practice and look at the effects on the body and becoming conscious of what we're feeling in the body in these situations. And for white, well, everyone, but I reading it for European descended people and Nordic descended people who have to recognize that people came to this country with trauma, and we've got to feel the trauma in the body that's present and that's still happening in the present trauma, but also the past trauma has remained in the body. So I really believe that this is an essential consciousness that has to be put forth here, or it's necessary. So his subtitle is Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. He looks at police, and he focuses on the white body supremacy that's present in all people who have come, lived under white supremacy. That this white body supremacy has been internalized Anyway, so that's it, check. And thank you all for your contributions.
Thank you.
Ronald, do you want to say something?
Yes, I'd just like to echo Richard's support for the book Stamped from the Beginning. And the author, Professor Kendi, as he was on his book tour about 5 years ago for that book, got a very strong response from audience members wanting to share this knowledge with younger readers, and he
Good.
consistently got that message. So coming out of that, Professor Kendi partnered with the award-winning young readers writer Jason Reynolds with 2 books based on Stamped from the Beginning. The young readers book is titled Stamped: Racism, Anti-Racism, in You, and it's co-authored by Professor Kendi and Jason Reynolds. And then a children's book came out a couple of years ago by Professor Kendi and Jason Reynolds, partnering with an illustrator, children's illustrator. And that book is called Stamped for Kids: Racism, Anti-Racism, in You. So I would like to add those 2 books to the foundational book, Stamped from the Beginning. And
Thank you.
hopefully a similar project will occur with the 1619 project book. Thank you.
Thank you.
19, it's a good book, but it's all the history, I'm sure.
Hi, Ronald. I remember you from years ago, coming to Wiser once in a while. Can you tell a little about the 1619 project? I know about it, but I don't know if everybody does.
Thank you, Marilyn. And I remember all the great work you've been doing throughout the years with John at Wiser. So thank you to you both. The struggle continues. 1619 project is by the great New York Times investigative journalists who many of us probably read in the media, where she was supposed to be teaching at her alma mater for a tenured position, but they rejected her, and after a public backlash, belatedly offered her a tenured job. But by that time, she decided to accept a position at Howard University in their journalism department. So the 1619 project, actually, the book actually has its history of about 5 years ago, where for the 400th anniversary of enslaved Africans being brought to this country, thus the name 1619, Nicole Hannah Jones, the investigative reporter, her beat has basically been throughout her career writing on race, racism, racial segregation in education, etc. So she proposed to the New York Times to do a special project on this historic anniversary of the 400th anniversary of enslaved Africans coming to this country. And she said she was pleasantly surprised. Not only did they want her to do this, but they wanted it to be a very robust project. And coming out of that was a standalone special issue magazine. And she was able to bring in different contributors, writers, public intellectuals, creatives, into this project. It went very well, but there was the beginnings of the pushback of these deniers of this history, and then this criticism of critical race theory. But there was enough momentum where the thought was, we need, a much larger canvas to tell this story, thus the 1619 book project. There is a children's book that is a companion to it called Born on the Water, that uses a narrative story to make the larger point of the 1619 project. I would highly recommend that for children to expose them to this very important history. I hope that answers your question, Marilyn. And again,
Yeah, that's helpful.
hearing you.
Mhm.
Thanks, that's great. So Richard, we have about 15 minutes left. I'm going to ask you first if you want to make any nearly concluding remarks, and then we'll give others a chance for another brief remark or two.
15 minutes left.
I simply first want to thank all of you for your patience for the technical difficulties we had at the beginning. I appreciate your hanging in there with me. I want to repeat simply that the more I learned about critical race theories, the better I liked it. And so I'm not a scholar. I'm an activist. I read stuff because I expect to learn something from what I'm reading that I can put to work on the street and get something done. But there is work going on that is being blocked by the controversy that the conservatives have insisted upon creating around critical race. And I'm simply urging us all, and I think that we'll be happy about our efforts to get smarter about this issue. And I thank you so much for your participation and your interest.
May I say, I wanted to add to after Ronald spoke, and I went to Philadelphia about 5 years ago, part of the Swedish community, American community, and I know Signe through the Sami network here and on different ways. But when I was there, they took us around to different sites, and the Swedes were so proud that they had this halcyon time in the 1600s. They didn't have slaves and they got along with the Indians. But then I picked up a few books and read them and learned that really the ones that got along with the Indians were descended from the Lapps, the Sami, and northern Scandinavia, partly descended, and they had similar values, but they did clear the land and end up being build cabins across the country and started that movement. But then I learned that about the Bacon Rebellion, when everyone was slaves, white, black, and Native American, they were all servants or something, about the same status. But then there was this rebellion that the whites largely started. And then after the rebellion, they separated the blacks out. And the whites could get out of it and be indentured servants, but the blacks could not get out. And the Native Americans were running away anyway, for the most part. So I think of that in conjunction with the 1619 Project, because that happened in the 1600s. And I just think, we've forgotten where white and black, I know there's been racism and ethnic, prejudice and similar things around the world, but the white and black extremism started in the 1600s, at least as far as I understand it at that time. So I just wanted to share that's my spiel.
Ronald, do you have something to add? I don't know if your hand's still up. If you had it further, your comments are great. If you had something further to add. Okay, I'm going to add one thing. I'm going to be a little slightly off topic. Since there's some visitors here as well as Wiser folks, I'm going to put in a little pitch for Wiser. Wiser's at a crossroads in our history. We've been around since 1975. There was a state law passed about 5 years ago that requires that we achieve national accreditation, else we will have to cease offering degrees to students. And we've made progress toward that, but it's expensive, labor intensive, and really difficult for accrediting people to wrap their head around what Wiser's about, although we are making progress. Many schools have since shut down because they haven't been able to make progress, unlike Wiser. But the state is getting, shall we say, less and less patient to wait for us to achieve that objective, and they are making it, that they give us extensions, and they say as long as they make progress, they'll probably give us an extension. But in the face of that, to be truthful, it's not easy for us to enroll new students unless the students are really kind of especially resonant with Weiser's mission. And we do have people that enroll knowing that we're in a little bit of a bind, but think it's a good calculated risk. And we've said that if the state allows us to do so, our faculty are willing to do a teach out with students and allow them to finish if we do have to, in the worst case scenario, wind down. In any case, keeping our enrollment up is really critical to our future. And we get students primarily through word of mouth. I mean, we do advertise a little bit, and we do get people from the state websites that tell people that we're approved for the state marriage family therapy license as far as an academic program and so forth. But we do rely on word of mouth. So I'm just going to put in a pitch that if any of you know, not even necessarily somebody who is looking to do graduate study in one of the fields that we offer degrees, education, community leadership, social change, marriage family therapy, and related counseling fields. If you know anybody who might be interested in considering pursuing a Weiser degree, please have them contact us. Our email is mail, M-A-I-L, at weiser.edu, wisr.edu, or me directly, John B. at wisr.edu. Set up a time to chat. Or maybe you don't know anybody who wants to enroll, but you might know people who might know people. They work with community agencies, they work with activist groups, they work with people interested in pursuing counseling careers, any of those sorts of things. I'm just going to put in a plug. Kind of keep that on your radar. Keep it in your mind. Refer people to us. So that's my pitch. Sadia, yes.
Yeah, and maybe add to it. We have been state approved for 40 years. And state approval was the same as accreditation, but the state decided they don't want to do it anymore. I don't know if it's because they're lazy or they ran out of money. And instead they wanted to push everybody to some expensive accreditation process. Yeah. And sometimes it seems like the accreditors don't really understand what we're doing, or and I just have to personally say that I did my doctoral degree at a highly acclaimed university, and I can honestly say that what I see at Weiser is 10 times broader, 10 times deeper, 10 times more woke than anything I experienced at the acclaimed Jesuit institution. You probably all know where that is. It's in San Francisco.
Yes, we do.
Okay, so I would just like to say, talk about education, talk about critical thinking, talk about gaining an ability to be an effective change agent in this world. Weiser is the place to be. And John, you said you are the present president of this university. You have been the only president of this university, ever.
Sigmund, thanks, Cynthia. Sigmund, you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to bring up the Segoriate Land Trust and the whole land back movement. I would hope that you all could, busy as you are, if you don't already know about the Segoriate Land Trust, that you look them up. I've worked for years with Karina Gould and Janella LaRose, and land back is an
Planting Justice is now working with them too. Planting Justice.
Exactly. Yeah. So
great.
That's it.
Thank you. We will keep them out. People.
I wanted to say one other thing. My daughter and some of her friends did a fundraiser for Segura Land Trust at the farmers market in Oakland near the lake, and they I guess sold cupcakes and cookies and got lots of donations. And I think by the end of the morning they had made something like $500 for the Segura Land Trust.
Very good.
A key element here is the She'umi. It's a voluntary tax that non-native people who now live on this land pay voluntarily to the land trust, the Seguritate Land Trust, that supports native development programs and securing land. So pay your Shuumi, SHUUUMI, Shuumi.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I've seen that poster in people's windows recently.
So, thank you. That's great. So listen, I'm going to almost.
Just want to thank Richard again for today.
Yeah,
And I
I
would
want to
love to have you again, Richard, maybe to talk about your book. I'm sure
Yeah, let's
that
do a
you
follow-up,
really
Richard.
enjoyed
soon.
this today.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks you all again. I appreciate it.
Wait, we got to plug Richard's book. Give everybody the title. It's available on Amazon.
Say the name of it.
Replaced by Amazon.
It's light, bright, damn near white. And you may not be able to tell by looking, but I am an African American and proud of it.
Great, thanks. And then I will close by saying we have 3.5 minutes. We're closing 3.5 minutes early. So uncharacteristically, because we have 3.5 minutes, for those that want to stay for 3.5 minutes, I'm sure Sadia has a song she wants to sing.
What?
Song you want to sing?
Oh, really? Okay, what song would you like? Bring my guitar quick. Thank you, John. Well, it could be an anti-war song or it could be a climate song that's kind of gone all around the world. Which should it be?
Do you have any civil rights songs?
This Little Light of Mine was one that.
Well, down by the riverside.
Sure. Let's do that one. I like that one.
Gonna lay down my sword and shield down
Down
by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. Gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside. I'm gonna study war no more. So
Hey,
civil rights and anti-war. I ain't gonna study war no more. 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 I'm gonna join hands around the world. I'm gonna join hands around the world. Down by the riverside.
Way down.
Down by the riverside.
Way down.
Down by the riverside. I'm gonna lay down
Down the world. Down
Down
by
by
the
the
riverside.
riverside.
We won't no more. I ain't gonna study war 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 no more. Which we used to sing during the presidential primaries. Going to join hands and walk with Bernie and walk around the
Listen,
world.
thank. I'm going to sign us off now, but thank you, Sadia. Thanks, Richard. Thanks,
Wait a second.
everyone.
Don't you want to hear one Phil Oak song about?
No.
Bye.
We got to run now, but let's. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
We
Thanks,
need to
everybody.
lay down.
Bye, everybody.
Rise up.